So in high tide, you really, the beach disappears right up under the naupaka.
Well, as you can see in this picture, it's, above knee height. These two beachgoers are trying to make their way. They've got their shoes in their hands, and I have a picture also of this property back in 1983, an aerial photograph as well as a photograph along the beach, which was the way it was when my kids were small. That shows a lot of beach in front of that property, even at high tide.
The Department of Land and Natural Resources has written to several owners on Kahala Beach asking them to cut back the vegetation that they feel is induced to grow toward the ocean. And they're asking owners to voluntarily comply to cut back the vegetation.
Well, I think Dolan can speak to that a little better than I can, but I believe it was in the spring of 2008, 12 properties were identified. And maybe Dolan, if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, as an advisor to the DLNR Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, I was involved with that effort to notify 12 landowners in Kahala that we conducted a site visit and observed that the wash of the waves went well into the vegetation. So as some of the pictures earlier illustrated, completely restricted any lateral access altogether. So using the public access as a justification for notifying people of a concern, the landowners, letters were written requesting cooperation in voluntarily removing vegetation. It wasn't an order. It was could you please help us with this problem? Of those 12 landowners, one of them complied, and the other is in the process of complying with our request now. So we may have eventually have 2 out of the 12 that will have complied. So that's kind of an ongoing effort, and the initial effort was a carefully crafted letter that didn't accuse anybody of any violations per se. There wasn't any direct evidence that they had broken any laws, but instead tried to ask for cooperation. The DLNR is continuing to kind of take the cooperative approach in the hopes that the landowners will eventually see the light and cooperate with the effort. But on another kind of related effort, I just wanted to point out too that this vegetation effort and the problems associated with induced vegetation and coastal landscaping in general, they are a statewide problem. It's not restricted to Kahala. We have a number of very similar complaints all over the state. So this isn't a problem that's restricted to just this one area. And many of the viewers out there probably have their own examples of areas that they've seen this problem occur. But I'll also point out too that shoreline vegetation is an important part of the ecosystem. We're not suggesting that all vegetation is bad, and instead it's more of an issue of what species are growing where, at what part of the beach they're growing. So for example, we mentioned naupaka and how and other very salt tolerant species. They're adapted to grow very well along the shoreline, even in the water at certain times of the year. Clearly in those cases where it's growing into the water, this is a problem for public access. There's a safety component here with being able to traverse the shoreline. And to some degree it does affect coastal processes in restricting transport of sediment. It can create a reflected wave if it's a more vertical type structure. It creates a vertical root structure. But that's not to say that some vegetation might be appropriate. And we did develop a set of guidelines, an illustration of sorts, that was guidance for landowners that do want to landscape in an appropriate manner. So there is a right way and a wrong way to landscaping the shoreline, and it really all comes down to where is that landscaping in relation to the shoreline. And so there is some guidance out there. We're trying to develop further guidelines on which species might be more appropriate in which parts of the beach. For example, what we're finding now is one of the big problems we're running into is this public access issue. But if naturally occurring native species that are low-growing grasses and vines more like what you might see naturally occurring on the seaward face of the dune were to grow there. They do provide some stabilization, but they don't restrict access. You can walk right over them.
So you're talking more about a healthy beach, a more natural beach?
Yes.
Something like
Rather than naupaka and shrub-like species that grow right down to the water and you can't get through them.
Is this an example of a healthy beach?
Yeah, so
here?
this image here would be an example of what I was referring to with the low-growing grasses and vines. They do provide some stabilization for the beach. They stabilize the wind-blown sand especially. But if somebody needed to walk across the face of that dune, they could, which brings up a whole nother issue about foot traffic erosion across dunes, but we'll leave that for another episode perhaps.
Dolan, what in this picture that we were just looking at, there appears to be 2 debris lines, and sometimes I've seen even as many as 3 debris lines. As a coastal geologist, if you were determining high water, what would you say about the debris lines? And in a picture like this, what part of that beach is public access and what part is not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this comes up a lot when we have discussions about shoreline setbacks, and they're of course based on the certified shoreline, which has essentially the same definition as our shoreline that's used for public access. And that's roughly defined as the upper reach of the wash of the waves, as I mentioned before. That has subsequently been interpreted by the Hawaii Supreme Court to mean specifically the highest wash of the highest wave that would occur on any given year. So for the viewers out there that may be wondering, well, I've seen debris lines and I've seen the wet-dry line, what we're looking for as coastal managers when we go to locate a shoreline is actually the furthest extent that the waves would reach during the highest tide or the highest surf event of the year, which makes our job very difficult because we have to be there on the right day. So we're very specific about watching the tide charts and the surf forecast and being there on the right days to observe, or at least observe the evidence of these events. So for a place like Kahala, you probably wouldn't be able to directly see the shoreline until you stick your head into the bushes and start to look for features that we commonly refer to are erosion scarps, little changes in topography that would indicate the waves were lapping there in the last year at least. Debris lines are helpful, but they may not always indicate the furthest extent. So where the debris line, vegetation line, and active erosion scarp coincide, it's very good evidence of what we might call the shoreline.
You know, to educate legislators about the specific issue in Kahala, Kahala community members, Lucinda and myself, and the neighborhood board chair, Scotty Anderson, and another resident named Carol Wilcox, invited legislators to walk on the beach, to view a few of the properties, and to understand that, you know, how much naupaka and how especially could block the beach and really impede being able to transverse the beach. And so it was a good education. They were barely able to get by, but they were able to understand that and see irrigation going outside of the fences, and certain owners trying to protect their properties.